I'd taken delivery of another order of stuff from Stu Mac, and I think it's now time I can start working on the fingerboard. I got some block inlays, so I think about starting around those cavities. I got a base for the Dremel, which I'll show you, and a couple of other small things. I've been thinking about exactly what order I want to do things in, and I think I'm going to radius the fingerboard before I do the inlays, just because I'm a little bit worried about sanding through the edges of some of the inlays. They're only about 1.5 millimeters thick, so it's not a lot of material, and it could sand through fairly easily. So yeah, let me show you what I got. These are the Perloid inlays that I've got. Not real pearl because I can't ship that from the US to Australia. Probably could have got some locally, but for a first try I'm okay with the fake stuff. I think this is what a lot of people use nowadays anyway. Base for the Dremel. It's beautifully nice visibility of what you're doing. The only problem is the build-up of dust. I had a little bit of a play in the MDF before. So yeah, I think I'm going to rough in the radius of the fretboard. It's going to be a 12-inch radius. I think I'll do that to about 80 grit, so it's still quite rough. And then I'll probably cut the cavities for the inlays. And then as I sand the finer grits into the fretboard, it will also put the same radius on the inlays. So I think that's the way I'm going to go. Right, so the fingerboard is now held down onto this little jig I've got with double-sided tape, the last of my double-sided tape. There's a line you can see coming through there. It comes back out this side as well. It's lined up with the center line on the fingerboard. Now that it's in place, these two outer rails are exactly the same width as this beam. You'll see that beam has a curve to it. It's a 12-inch radius, and it has 80 grit sandpaper stuck to it. Now what happens, this beam fits snugly in between the two rails, and then it slides back and forth like so. And it will sand the radius into the fingerboard. It takes a while, it's a lot of hard work, so I'm going to start doing that now. Alright, here we go. I've been at this for a bit over an hour now. And as you can see from the sandpaper there, I'm still quite a long way from finished. Maybe halfway through. When you're doing this job, you need to be careful of paying attention to your natural biases. I know that when I do this job, I tend to be biased towards the base side of the fingerboard and the nut end. So this corner here tends to take a lot more of my pressure than, say, that one up there. It tends to be my weakest corner. You can usually tell by the amount of sawdust collected at either end. And you can also sometimes see on the sandpaper itself. So you've got to pay attention to that and adjust the pressure as you go. I wanted to get this done tonight, but I just don't think I'm going to get there. So I'll finish it off tomorrow. There we have a roughed-in neck blank. It's not 100% right down to the centre yet, but it's very, very close. And it'll be tidied up with the later grits anyway. So I'm going to clean it up and start marking out where the inlays need to go. I've laid out where all of the inlays need to go. Marked all. I just put tape on the frets that needed inlays. Lined the appropriate block up with the center line and scribed around the edges and pulled out the tape. I have done the very first slot there. It took me a little while. So freehand route it with the Dremel. The tiny drill bit in there. Router bit, sorry. Have to be very, very careful. This is an easy job to screw up, so I'm going very slowly. But I'll film a little bit of the next one so you can see how I do it. There we have the inlay cavities all routed. I've routed them all with a Dremel, cleaned them all up with a chisel, and they all now will fit in their cavities, most of them pretty damn snug. So how I'm going to install them is, my plan is to use super glue to hold them in, and then mix some epoxy with rosewood sawdust to get the colour to match the board and use that to fill any gaps. I think that's what I'm going to do. Unless I can't find any super glue, then I'll probably just use epoxy for the whole thing. But yeah, I'll let you know how I go. So the fingerboard is now inlaid and radiused and sanded down to a nice smooth finish. For the first time doing hand routed inlays, I'm pretty happy with that. But it wasn't without its problems. First of all, a couple of the inlays, particularly these two, I routed the pockets a little bit too deep. I don't know if it was when it was with the Dremel or maybe cleaning it up afterwards with the chisel, but that is a problem. The reason it's a problem is that when I glue the inlays in at that depth, I then need to sand the entire board down low enough to match the depth of the lowest one, so the board stays flat. That means taking quite a lot of material off the top, and now the board is a little bit thinner than I might have liked it to be. Only, a few thousandths, but it's lower nonetheless. And apart from being a lot of hard work, it also means that the fret slots might end up being fractionally shallow, and that could be a problem because I don't have a saw that has a thin enough blade to cut fret slots. So I'll either need to, if they are too shallow, I'll either need to buy or borrow a saw that can do that job. But that's a lesson learned. I also super glued in the inlays, and then used epoxy mixed with rosewood sanding dust to fill in the gaps, and it worked quite well. There's no visible gaps in there. If you look super closely at some of them, you can see where they were filled, but it's near invisible. And once the fretboard's oiled, it will be almost invisible. So that came out pretty well. I'm happy with that. The next time I do it, I think I'll just mix the rosewood dust with the epoxy and use that to glue the inlays in themselves. Because I never used epoxy before, and it's quite a bit thicker than I was expecting it to be. And trying to get it down into the cavities was a bit of a pain. So if I have it in there straight away and push the inlays in, it'll squeeze and fill those gaps by itself, and I won't have to do that extra step. So these are just some lessons learned for next time. Still need to taper it, obviously, and haven't decided yet if I'm going to bind it first or once it's already glued on, and then also bind a little bit of the neck itself. So I'll decide that later. Don't have to make that decision now. But yeah, cool.